forward. Cool. So anyhow, I'm so excited. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being here for this clinic. I really wanted to just break down the sequencing stuff today. And, you know, a lot of the sequencing information, there's so much, right? But today I really hope to just give you a good solid basic level 101 for sequencing. There's so much information that I can toss at you. But again, I want to keep it kind of condensed so that way you have good solid structural stuff going forward. Going into a class doesn't have to be hard, you know, teaching a class to people, no matter who they are, no matter what style you're teaching, no matter what level that particular group might be, even if it's all levels, it can be very confusing for the teacher if we go in without a plan, which most people do go in with plans, or B, if we try to create something that's very dance-like. So let me talk to you about dance-like stuff. I don't know if any of you have ever been to kind of like a vinyasa flow class that has the quote unquote mandala flows. It's super interesting. You basically move from the front edge of your mat to the back edge of your mat and take a spin and move back to the front edge of your mat and move to the back edge of your mat and then reverse it to the front edge of the mat to the back. It's such an interesting way to do things. I'm not accustomed to it personally, and I personally find that when I'm in a class that's like that, it's confusing, not only for me, and I've been practicing yoga for 25 years, but it's confusing for everyone around me. So I'm not going to say don't do mandala flows, and I'm sorry for those of you who might, you know, who really love them. Maybe they're awesome for you, but for a lot of people, this is simple choreography, and people are coming to us as yoga instructors to give them, you know, some movement guidance, some safety guidance, some stability and strength and flexibility guidance, and certainly asana, certainly, you know, physical posture and things like that. But and I say with all the love in my heart, if they wanted to learn how to dance, they would go to like a salsa class. You know, I really do say that with all the love in my heart. If you want to create a yoga and a dance class together, do the mandala flow, because then you can teach like a whole sequence, right? So that's a little bit of a tangent. So I'm going off on a little tangent, but there's dancey styles that I'm going to kind of direct you away from in order to keep things simple, right? There's trying to create a class around a peak pose can be useful, but it can also be confusing for people. And I'm going to go into that a little bit too. Actually, I'll just do that right now. The reason why I find that it's confusing for people to kind of structure a class around peak poses is because typically when we're going into the idea, we as teachers might have this amazing posture that we're trying to like lead people up to, and it's super, super cool and it can be done well. However, most of the time we end up going a little bit too into all the different ways that we can make that posture possible. So, okay, that's cool, right? I'm going to give you an example of something that I've done in the past that made it very confusing for my students. 1 month, I typically do themes for every single month. So this month is the intermediate series. We're focusing and really studying the intermediate series of the Ashtanga practice this whole month. But I've done 1 whole month on the posture, the grasshopper pose, which is a really hard arm balance. And you have to have super open hips, and you have to have a super good crow pose. And, you know, all these structural components have to be made possible in order to create that final asana at the end of your practice. So I've confused people because I've focused only on arm balances, for example, to get us to the grasshopper posture without giving people adequate opportunities to open hips. I have a lot of guys I work with and they need open hips. So it can be very confusing when we're not inserting all of the different ways to get to the peak posture. Or we're doing so much of one thing that we're forgetting about all the other things. So, and I guess what the tangent really comes down to is creating imbalance, because when we're working on peak postures, now all suddenly we're only working on one thing or maybe 2 things, and we're not inserting all the other things. So this makes sense, right? If we're giving a class and we're focusing on heart openers, that's really awesome. We also have to have the reverse of that. right? So that makes sense. In classes, I've been to so many classes, and this is, again, a little bit of a tangent, where the heart opener was the only thing that we did. So every single posture had this like enormous back bend going on. By the end of the practice, my back was really, really sore. And then 5 days later, my back was still very sore. So again, there's a number of different things that I'm just going to speak to from experience that I just want to kind of keep people away from, at least for right now, while you're building your confidence levels, moving into building sequences that are really safe and well-rounded and good for everybody. So that being said, I do speak from the Ashtanga lens, which most folks who've worked with me before do know. I've received an advanced certification and training with Kino McGregor and Tim Feldman of the Miami Life Center. They're amazing people. I've worked with a number of other Ashtangis all over the world. And I've done all sorts of different things to create, and this is my personal approach, to create accessibility through the Ashtanga practice. I think, you know, one of the things that I was putting in like the newsletters this week, for example, just leading up to this clinic, is the concept that I feel like there's kind of one key thing that needs to shift in all of our mentalities. And for me, and for so many people I've talked to who are newer teachers and just teachers in general, is that Ashtanga is too hard for people, way too hard for everybody. It's way too rigid, it's way too controlling, it's way too, dare I say, militant. And we can all agree that perhaps some of those things might feel true. But my question has always been like, why? Why do we think like that? And it's probably because we've been told that this is the way it is, you know? Or you've gone to a class with a very traditional teacher who has come over to you and given you a good old-fashioned rinse out, you know, a good old-fashioned manipulation with their arms. But the shift that I'm trying to create as a yoga teacher mentor is, let's take the fear out of Ashtanga. So how do we do that? And how do we create safe, accessible sequencing that's not confusing and is available to all bodies? Okay, so I'm going to give you a number of things about that today. Rocket practitioners in the class, I think that's super cool. The rocket is a form. I'm going to do this. It's a loose form of Ashtanga. Larry Schultz and Indu Bhargwaj, I can't pronounce her last name, it's terrible, but the two of them recreated kind of they pulled asanas out of the Ashtanga sequences, the primary, the second, and the advanced A and B sequences, and they put together more accessible, quote unquote, it's still very, very difficult, the rocket's still very difficult, but more accessible postures too. And I'm going to do a lot of air quotes today because their whole thing is it's going to get you there faster, right? So I think that that's actually, you know, it's valid, it's perfectly valid, but I do think that we can use that concept of getting people there faster with a grain of salt, but also with some truth behind it in accessible Ashtanga sequencing. So I like the rocket because I like that they literally have taken the postures that feel like they are workable for most able-bodied people. The thing that I disagree with the rocket is that they do want us to do things like sleeping pigeon, which for most people it's accessible, but if you have a knee injury, it's really difficult, right? So the rocket doesn't really have a lot of modifications. Ashtanga doesn't have a lot of modifications. So this will be a whole different clinic that I will speak to at length about modifications. Again, today I want to talk about a template for sequencing. And again, because I want to keep this accessible for teachers and easy for teachers, I'm also going to talk about the concept of putting this style of sequencing into things like yin yoga, restorative yoga. Hatha is like an umbrella of asana, typically. It's just like, you know, physical movement. I'm not going to mess with the hot, what is it, the hot 32, the, dare I say, Bikram. I'm not going to mess with that one because he does his own, they do their own thing over there. But we can still create accessibility with sequencing with all these different forms. So I have a lot of teachers I work with who are yin teachers, who are not Iyengar per se, that's more Ashtanga lineage oriented, but vinyasa specific, and vinyasa is an umbrella. And we all kind of understand that as the, kind of a teacher's lens. We understand that vinyasa means, breath with movement. Everything that moves is labeled vinyasa. We're breathing as we move, that's labeled vinyasa. We can't just hold our breath and call it vinyasa, that doesn't work. But how do we keep that part safe while people are moving? So I have personally developed over the years a way for all of us to kind of play in the same sandbox from the Ashtanga lens. So bear with me, because I definitely have had a lot of like vinyasa teachers come up to me and say, your class is too hard, I'm not doing it. I'm like, but I give all sorts of, options and levels and modifications and cues. And really, I think what it boils down to again is just this need to shift consciousness that we can use the intelligence of that particular form and just spread it out. We can really play in the same sandbox, and I really think that it's good for everybody. I've been teaching this way for years, so here's my method. You ready? Method rule number 1. You ready? This is good. Make sure you write this down. Method rule number 1. I'm always talking about the Tristana method. The Tristana is the foundation of Ashtanga. The Tristana is nothing more than breathing with sound, typically. The second component are the bandhas, Mula Bandha, Uddiyana Bandha. Mula Bandha is, of course, your pelvic floor engagement. Uddiyana Bandha is lifting upward the belly button toward the spine. So we have a nice solid engagement in the base of your in the base of your core. And then drishti, which is the third part. So that is your gaze point. Now listen, most people can do breath bandhas drishti. I mean, bandhas are hard. Bandhas are hard to describe and explain, right? They're really difficult, and they're not something that we can check for. It's just not. I mean, we can tell if someone's belly breathing versus if they're breathing more up into the upper regions of their lungs. But for the most part, the Tristana method, being the foundation of Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga, is accessible for people even in a chair. And I love that, because I can say to them, hey, you're doing Ashtanga yoga, Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga. And I want to differentiate, because the Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga is the actual breathing and moving asana piece of the 8-limb system. The actual Ashtanga is the 8-limbed approach, which we'll go into in another clinic. But the Ashtanga Vinyasa piece, everyone can do breath bandhas drishti. And that's awesome, because now you can do breath bandhas drishti in a restorative class. Now you can do breath bandhas drishti in a yin class. And there's, in my brain, there's a distinction. In other people's brain, there's not distinction between the two. I can talk about that if you have questions, but you can bring in breath bandhas drishti in regular vinyasa classes, in inversion clinics, in, any sort of workshops that you might be doing, any sort of other additional element that you might be teaching, because bringing the breath and the bandhas and the drishti into the fold could really help people create internal focus. So we can call them into internal focus. We can cue them all across the board to internal focus, but these are the really basic things that people can do. And to be honest, focusing on breath with sound alone brings tons of focus for most people. So that's really wonderful. And I love that that's, a very accessible thing for everyone. And this can even be for people with injuries. Breath bandhas and drishti are very, very accessible for all. The core work, here's another piece to do the core work, the bandhas, to even in like a HIIT yoga class, high intensity interval training, I will tell people we're breathing in to expand, we're breathing out to contract, and I want you to contract your core. And I will talk about the bandhas, the Uddiyana Bandha, the Mula Bandha, even in like a high intensity interval training environment. Because I don't know about you all, but when I was growing up and went to the gym, I hurt my back enormously and was probably on the verge of a slip disc and ended up in physical therapy because my core was weak. I didn't know to engage inside the transverse abdominal layer. I had no idea. So how do we insert these things moving forward? And my answer really is just do it. Just keep it simple. Just keep it basic. Just tell people to engage their core, whatever you're putting them into, okay? So that's kind of my rule number one, stick with the Tristana method. It'll help everybody who you're working with just maintain their own inner focus. And of course, as we all know, the yoga asana practice is, you know, kind of like the vessel for other layers of yoga, like the meditation, the pranayama, the deeper states of meditation that we're working on as we move up the 8-limb system. So we want to bring people into awareness with breath, even when they're in something like wheel pose or inversions or downward dog, or of course, child's pose. It's easier for people because we're in a neutral state, right? But get them in neutral state first so that they can understand breath bandhas drishti, and then have them float into something a little bit more challenging with breath bandhas drishti, okay? So hopefully that helps. Anybody have any questions? Do you have any questions so far about that? And you can, you know, if something comes up, you can always stop me. It's totally cool. Totally cool. Okay. My second rule is to use the template of the Ashtanga practice. Again, reconfiguring the notion that Ashtanga is too challenging. Just throw that idea right out the window right now, because we all do some sort of warm up at the start of our practices. We all do some sort of standing posture sequence that includes, you know, lateral, linear, twists, balancing. Right? We all do some seated postures somewhere in our sequence that involve like hip openers and twists and deeper forward folds. And most of us do some form of back bends, and some of us do some inversions. But to keep it really simple, that's the template. So the template is warm up, aka Surya Namaskar, sun salutations. Okay? Sometimes I will warm up my my slow flow classes with a child's pose first, and then a cat and cow, and then a downward dog, and some movement in downward dog, and a rag doll, and then I'll go to half sun salutations. Again, I don't want to give you like very specific asanas, but I'm going to give you like the chunks. Because if we can think about the practice in terms of chunks, now we can also stay consistent with time, which is a huge deal for a lot of teachers. I know, like, I'm really guilty of this. My clock is broken. Bear with me with that for a moment. But if I go over class, it's because I am not looking at my clock and I'm forgetting about my chunk. So Surya Namaskars, your warm-up should only be about 10 to 12 minutes. You know, your warm-up should be 10 to 12 minutes. If you're just doing sun salutations, awesome, 10 to 12 minutes. If you're doing traditional Ashtanga, 5A Surya Namaskar, 5B Surya Namaskar, it should take 12 minutes. I've timed myself numerous times. It's always a 12-minute long process. So I like that, you know, because it's consistent. It's always consistent, right? Standing postures for me, if I'm doing traditional Ashtanga, all the standing postures, with sun salutations and all the standing postures, it's a half hour every time. It's always a half hour. I'm like, okay, cool. By the end of the half hour, I'm sitting down, I'm doing some hip openers, I'm doing some seated postures, some core work, that sort of thing. Okay. Once you get to the seated postures should only take 10 minutes. Only. If you're doing like a very traditional Ashtanga practice, you're going to take a little bit more on that, because if you're doing full primary, that's about a 75, 78 to 90-minute long practice. But if you're keeping it at 60 minutes, then just devote 10 minutes to your seated postures, you know? And seated postures are meant to be either restorative and easy, or deeper, much more like a yin practice. So a yin posture that I want to bring attention to is sleeping pigeon. So I've already said it, you know, once. So the pigeon posture with the one knee forward and the other leg extended back. Okay. So, and we did it today in practice. So that particular posture can be very restorative for a lot of people. It can also be really intense. It can be really, really intense depending upon who we're working with. So if you're doing 10 minutes of seated postures and your pigeon's in there, you might want to make sure your pigeon has 2 minutes each side. And then you only have enough space for a couple of other postures. it's a-okay for you to just do 3 seated postures and keep it very long for each posture, rather than, the Ashtanga 5 breaths and then you're out. So if you're not familiar, folks at home, with the Ashtanga practice, typically we hold everything for 5 counts of breath. Again, when you get to a pigeon posture, though, it's a tease. Don't do it. People will not be happy with you. They'll be like, wait a second, I'm just getting settled in pigeon. But, something simple like a nice forward fold for 5 rounds of breath, it's typically good because, and the reasoning behind that, I want to give a reason behind the 5 count of breath. I think, like, again, there's intelligence to this whole practice. I think it's really useful, is 5 rounds of breath, especially if you're doing it very slow and deliberate and metronomic, if that's even a word. I might have created a word today. But if you can think about a metronome, where you're inhaling on a 4 count, exhaling on a 4 count, keeping the inhale to exhale very equal, you're about 30 seconds deep after 5 rounds of breath. So 30 seconds, according to kinesiology, chopping the word up, and physiology, according to those kinds of ideas, is enough time for your muscles to finally kind of get over the fight or flight response and start to go into relaxation, right? So it's a really good amount of time. Some people swear by the restorative idea that we want to stay in each posture for 5 minutes. This is also a yin concept. You want to stay in each posture for 5 minutes. Now, listen, if you're in pigeon for 5 and you're okay with that, your body can sustain that, then, you've got 10 minutes right there, 5 minutes right side, 5 minutes left side, you're out. Now you're moving on to a different chunk of your template. But for the most part, most people can't sustain that. So, I mean, again, which is why I like about 2 minutes on each side, but the 30-second time frame is typically 5 rounds of breath. So when you're cueing people, even if you're thinking to yourself, 1, 2, 3, so I'm trying to keep it equal. 4, 5, that might have been a little less than 30 seconds, but you get the point. Like it's a good chunk of time to keep people in a posture before pulling them out. And that's true for standing postures. That's true for inversions, Some of the inversions in the Ashtanga practice are held much longer, but for new folks, for new folks though, 5 is plenty. It's a lot for people, so we're building up to 5, but if you're in something like a warrior 2, 5 rounds of breath is great, because now we're really working the stabilization muscles. We're really working the flexibility piece that wants to happen in the warrior, but it's a strengthening posture by nature. So, so that's a part of your standing series too. Okay, so we've talked about the warm-up chunk, 12 minutes. We've talked about the standing postures. That's another 18 minutes, right? We've talked about the seated postures. That's about another 10 minutes. Now I want to talk to you about the finishing postures. Definitely take 10 minutes with finishing postures. Okay. Finishing postures from the Ashtanga practice are, on the exterior, they look pretty intense. There's a lot of inversions. There's a lot of, there's back bends and inversions in those. So I always include the back bends. So I would include 3 back bends, whether that's, a camel pose or a bow pose or a locust pose or a bridge pose or a wheel pose, just consider some sort of something to help folks at the end. The reason behind that from the Ashtanga lens, and I love this, is that according to the yogis, the more mobile and flexible our spines are, the younger we are, right? So I love that. I'm like, oh, I want to stay young for a while. I want to feel mobile. I want to feel like I've got good quality of life. So I love the back bends, even if I'm just doing a very easy back bend, a restorative Bridge pose is awesome. Restorative fish pose is incredible. 5 rounds of breath and restorative postures is not enough, as you all know. So I would stay in those for at least a full minute, okay? Maybe two minutes if you're gonna go at it from that longer angle. But don't skip the back bends in your finishing sequence chunk, okay? Don't skip the back bends, definitely do them. I can't tell you how many vinyasa classes I've been to where I'm like, did you even think about the fact that we've just forward folded this whole time with no reverse action, you know, and it's not, I don't mean to be like, hang on a second, bad yoga teacher, but at the same time, we're looking to create well-roundedness in our practices, right? So the back bends in the finishing sequence are really important because at that point, our bodies are warm, really ready to move into something more bendy. And of course, you know, just as an intricacy, we do want to try to emphasize breath bandhas and drishti in the back bends because back bends are fight or flight, people. Like, I don't know about you all, but I'm in a back bend and before I know it, I'm like, you know, so how do we try to bring it back to a state of kind of equilibrium, even when we're in something intense? And back bends for most folks are really, really intense, really, really intense. So one of my teachers actually calls it like, not fight or flight, but she calls it like, oh goodness. All right, I totally lost it, but she really refers to back bends as though they're like, you feel like you're going to die, essentially, especially if you're doing like full wheel pose. From the Ashtanga practice, we do full wheel at least 3 times, sometimes 5. My teachers are always like, Jenni Sol, you need 5 more. And I'm like, no, I don't. And they're like, yes, you do. 5 more. I know. I'm like, you don't understand. They're like, yes, we do. But if you're going at that from a restorative angle or a more yin angle or somebody in a chair angle, I would say have them just do something very easy so that they can maintain openness across the center of the chest. They can maintain the thoracic spinal mobility piece in a very, very simple manner. Do I go into, I'm not going to do it. I was just going to distinguish yin from restorative. I'll do that at the end if you remind me, or maybe I'll try to remember. The other piece to your finishing chunk though, definitely do some sort of inversion. Now listen, some yoga studios, if you're working for studios, some yoga studios actually ask us teachers not to teach inversions. And I don't agree with that. I feel like that takes the empowerment out of the practice for our students. And not only that, they've just learned it from some other teacher at a different studio, and now they're going to come here and they're going to try it rogue in the back of the room. And if they're not doing it correctly, now that's on you. Okay. And that's a huge piece for me that I feel is so inadequate about studios telling us not to teach inversions. I would personally much rather teach it correctly and safely than watch someone do it rogue off in the corner and hurt themselves badly, you know? So if you don't practice inversions on your own and you don't really have an inversion practice, it's a little bit of a different story. You're going to encourage people not to do inversions until you understand how to do it yourself. But one of the more simple inversions is one everyone can do. It's legs up the wall, you know, and it's a great restorative inversion. You know, it's great to have the legs lifted above the heart. You can simply just lay down with your students and say, here's how it's done. Another one that I like for people in like in a chair, for example, if they can make it to the floor, some of them can't, but I'm going to give you the exception. Some of them can make it down to the floor. You can have them put their legs up on the chair, and that's actually really nice. If they cannot make it down to the floor, they can sit in a chair and prop their legs up a little bit higher, or put their legs up on a wall while they're still sitting in a chair. So again, it's not about intensity, it's about specificity. So make sure there's some sort of legs elevated posture in there, okay, as part of your finishing piece to the structure. And then of course, Counter stretches are really important. I'm going to talk about counter stretches just in general. If you forward fold, you should have some sort of back bend in there. Okay, so a good rule of thumb and something that the Ashtanga practice does really well, I think, is they insert vinyasa in between everything. So better for worse, right? Some people can't access all the vinyasas, that's fine. I have my students just simply do a little low cobra pose and a child's pose. Okay, but the cobra pose is the intentional piece, especially after a forward fold. So we want to reopen, to remobilize before going back into another forward fold. Otherwise, it's forward fold, forward fold, forward fold, forward fold. And we sit too long in our lives as it is. Our hips are in constant flexion. We need that reverse order. So please build in the counter stretches into your sequence. Again, I'm not going to like give you exact asana to do today. We can certainly talk about like all of those things to do in the future. But the template, again, I'm just going to go through it one more time just to make sure you have it in your notes. It's the warm up, 12 minutes. It's the standing posture, another 18 minutes. It's the seated postures, keep it at 10 minutes. It's the finishing postures. It's your fourth chunk. That's another 10 minutes. And now you have about 5 to 10 minutes to play with for Shavasana. Again, this follows a 60-minute class structure. And if you have 5 to 10 minutes to play with Shavasana, my teachers are always like, 7 to 8 minutes for Shavasana is really ideal. 12, 15 minutes is more ideal, but you can navigate that into a class if you have a little more time, or if you take out some of the postures just in general to give them more time at the end. So just be really intentional about, the end piece, because this is kind of the closure of your sequence. This is the closure of your practice. I've made the mistake many times, again, because I'm looking at a broken clock where I'm going, oh no, we only have 5 minutes left and we're just upside down and I still want to get people into Shavasana. So then I'm either going against the clock, keeping people over time a little bit, which is not my favorite thing to do, or I'm cutting Shavasana short. So it's better to give Shavasana than to not give Shavasana. That's definitely my rule of thumb. Even if it's just a minute long, you can create intentionality around that. You can tell people, let's breathe, count backwards from 10. That's about equivalent to a minute. Maybe it's a little bit longer depending on how fast or slow you're going. You can guide them a visual, kind of an audio visual Shavasana kind of a meditation over the course of a minute or two to really relax them. But the idea there is for them to kind of drip back down to center so that way they can come out. They can come back to life feeling as though they got what they really came for. And, most people come to yoga because we need to move, but we also need to rest. And sometimes we don't realize we need to rest until the very end when it hits us after all of that movement. So the restful pieces are really important. I have done meditation, pranayama and meditation with people at the end if I have a little more time. I do like to sometimes toss in the Nadi Shodhana. If we would have had a little more time today in our class, I would have tossed in some Nadi Shodhana because it's really nice for rebalancing and recentering. Another one that I really like that's actually more simple is the Dirga Swasam, which is the 3-part breath, where you're breathing in all the way down to the belly, filling up the middle of the ribs, and then all the way up into the lungs before breathing it out in reverse from the top, middle, and bottom. So that one my seniors love. My seniors love the 3-part breathing technique because they can literally just sit upright, even if it's in their chair, and they can breathe in 3 parts. And that's a really nice segue to either Shavasana if they can't lay down on the floor, or just a nice meditation. So I kind of went through that really fast, like really, really fast. Another thing that I want to have you think about before I take any questions, if that's okay with you, is I know I said I'm not going to go through specific asanas, and I'm not, but I want to keep you focused on the well-roundedness. And this would be my rule number 3, the well-roundedness to your sequencing. Is that if you are warming people up, please make sure that they are in fact warm, before putting them in something deeper. Please make sure that you do in the standing and the seated postures, linear movements, which are up and down, lateral movements, which are right to left, twists, which everybody loves. You can do twists standing. We did chair twist today. We did lunge twist today, the Parshvanottanasana B. There's linear, lateral, twists, and balances. So seated postures, you're not probably going to balance unless you're doing like an arm balancing class with people. And then you might have them do some arm balances when you get closer to the floor. But the balancing, of course, when you're standing up, there's a lot of standing balancing postures that are accessible to all. I mean, I have my my chair folks typically just stand up with their hand on a chair and they do tree pose, or hand on a wall, they do tree pose. It's pretty awesome. My Ashtanga people were doing the hand to big toe posture, So it really kind of depends on the group. Restorative people, you can still have them do tree pose. I really actually like inserting things that are a little bit more challenging before taking them down 10 notches to restorative land. Because according to the Ashtanga system, and I love this again about Ashtanga, we need to move our bodies in all sorts of ways in order to meditate. And the restorative practice brings us internal, so that way we can create a more meditative state. Some people get to restorative classes and they're so fidgety from the day, really, really fidgety. And I notice it all the time. Sometimes it takes people a good half hour before they can just like really center and calm right down to get into that restorative state. So giving them a couple of bits of movement that might feel a little bit more intense, like tree pose is not super intense, but it can be intense for some people, is a good thing to do before bringing them all the way down to a restorative state. So again, you can use the same template in restorative classes, yin classes, vinyasa classes. I just keep kind of talking about those 3, but there's so many others. I've even used this template in like high intensity interval training classes, and my students really love it because they know what's coming next. It's a very kind of repeatable pattern, even if it's not the same exact thing every time, the structure is the same. And what I think is really good about that is not only do they know what they're doing, but we also know what we're doing. And that's the whole point, right? Is to make sure that we remember what we're doing. So if we stay within the structure, now we know what we're doing. And the template is like, okay, just stick to the template. I have had times where I do creatively veer around the template and I make my way back eventually, but that's because I've been doing this for a very long time. But to, again, just to create confidence and to create like a different level of understanding for ourselves as teachers, just stick with the template. And you can put the template on a larger sheet of paper where you have columns, where you have the warm up, where you have the standing postures, where you have the seated postures and the finishing postures, and then Shavasana can be whatever it needs to be. But you can write out a couple of different things for each column. And I think one of the bigger things for my students who I work with is they all love when I change the sequence up. They love Ashtanga. They come here for the Ashtanga, but boy, do they love it when I get creative and they're like, oh yeah, we're doing something different. So good. So if you like the structure, stick with one sequence, create your own sequence, stick with it based on that template. If you love that structure, if you know your students are going to get a lot from it, it's a really solid way for your students to get familiar and to understand and to gain some level of mastery, even if you only offer that structure over the course of a month, like I do. Like I said, a theme every month. So that way my students can start to really hone in on that specific thing. over the 30-day period. So it gives people also a level of confidence, and then they want to keep coming back because now they're feeling more confident on their mats. And you're more confident because now you've had a chance to also teach that thing many times. So I love that about the Ashtanga practice, that this is the, again, it's not the stringent, militant, difficult, athletic, circus style stuff. We don't have to focus on that, you know, but instead, if we could just kind of rewind and say, actually, there's a lot of intelligence to the structure, then we can really use that to our advantage as teachers. So take those concepts and keep it simple. Just keep it simple and let me know how it goes. Do you have any questions?
I think for me, like, do boom, go right into sun salutation. So this is, so like a half sun, is that standing to fold and then coming just back up from there, and then adding on from there. Full Sunday, I guess.
Totally, yep. Half sun salutations. I think that's fair game in the warm-up. I do that with a lot of my my office yogis. I teach a lot of office yoga too, to people who don't move around that much. They actually just sit all day and work at the computer. Half sun salutations are awesome because they can stretch, they can still move, they can still breathe. They're still extending through the spine, they're still flexing into the back, and then they can come all the way back up and just, it's just a different way for them to be moving. And I do get them down to table pose, I do get them down to cat and cow, and you can thread those into your sun salutations. Full-on chaturangas, most people have no business doing full-on chaturangas until they can do like a push-up really strongly. But that's, again, that's another observational thing that we would do as teachers. If you notice that people are dropping like flies because you're starting the Surya Namaskars or regular traditional sun salutations with chaturangas, even on your knees, I have so many students who are like, oh, and then they just collapse down. So it's like, how do we get them to a place where they start to understand, to be a little bit more in tune with how they're moving through something like the chaturanga, you know? So the half sun salutation is good because you can get them moving with confidence for them and for you. Yeah, that's cool. And I bring that in even to my advanced classes. Even with my advanced people, I'm like, half sun salutations, everybody, here we go, you know, just to get them into the breath. Because again, the concept of vinyasa is to move with your breath. It's the inhale to expand. It's the exhale to contract, you know? So if we can get people into the habit of moving with their breath, then they become more aware of even seating or sitting and how they're breathing. It's not necessarily a default mechanism at that point, because especially if we're here rounded at the computer all day, or we're probably not going to be like, unless we're thinking about it. But the movement piece really brings more oxygen into the full lung capacity, and that's really what people are looking for, is just to, that's a part of the feel better, right? That's a part of the serotonin. The oxygen really helps to kind of increase some of that, and it just feels so good to fill the lungs full. You don't have to do all the fancy stuff or all the strength building stuff. Cool. Any other thoughts? I'm sure there's like other, and folks at home, if there's other questions too, feel free to email me, type it in. I'm going to actually upload this video to, I'm creating a Facebook group for us. So I'm going to put it into the Facebook group for people to access. And then if you have questions, just, you can pop it into the Facebook group under the video in the comments, and that'll be great. And then I'll just kind of keep a running tally of what folks are asking about and keep going from there. You know? So again, there's so much more that I could talk about today, but I feel like just giving you the template of the structure of what the Ashtanga practice says, hopefully you feel like you can use that to move forward with in structuring your classes, so that way you feel a little bit more confident with what you're doing. So cool. Any last burning question? Okay. So I'm going to sign off here. Again, folks at home, if you're watching this, ask questions, please. I'm happy to answer, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.